On a warm California night in the middle of the 1970s, in a small club just off the Sunset Strip, Richard Pryor stood in the dark at the edge of the stage and did something he almost never did. He stopped performing in his own head. He just watched. Out under the lights, George Carlin was working a crowd that had come to laugh, and for a few long seconds, nobody was laughing at all. The room had gone completely silent. Not the silence of a joke that missed, the silence of a room that had stopped breathing. Pryor leaned against a black curtain in the wings, close enough to see the sweat on Carlin's forehead, close enough to hear the words land before the audience could decide what to do with them. And when it was over, when Carlin finally walked off into the dark, Pryor said one sentence to him. Just one. Carlin would repeat it to himself for years. To understand what that sentence was, and why it stayed with a man like George Carlin, you have to understand what was happening on that stage, and what was happening inside both of these men in those strange, restless years when neither one of them was sure who he was supposed to be. George Carlin had already lived one entire career by then. A few years earlier, he had been the clean-cut young man in the suit and tie, the one who made the safe jokes on the safe shows, the comedian the networks loved because he never frightened anyone. He had short hair and a bright smile and a voice made for television. And he had walked away from all of it. By the middle of the 1970s, the suit was gone. His hair was long now, past his shoulders. He wore a beard and a denim jacket, and he looked less like a television host and more like the people sitting in the audience. He had decided that the safe version of himself was a kind of lie, and he had torn it down on purpose, knowing it might cost him everything. It nearly did. There were nights when the old crowds walked out, confused and angry that the nice young man they remembered was gone. There were nights when he wondered if he had thrown away the only thing he was ever good at. But there was something underneath all of it that he could not let go of. He had started to believe that comedy was not only about getting the laugh. He had started to believe it could be about telling the truth so plainly that people had no choice but to hear it. And that belief was dangerous, because the truth does not always make a room laugh. Sometimes it makes a room go silent. It was the middle of the 1970s, and Los Angeles had become a kind of laboratory for a new kind of comedy. The old rooms were still there, the polished nightclubs, the coat-and-tie crowds, the comedians who told safe jokes about airline food and mothers-in-law. But something else was growing on Sunset Boulevard. A small club with a plain brick wall and a single spotlight had become the place where the most fearless comedians in America came to try things they could not try anywhere else. There were no cue cards there, no network censors sitting in the back. The audiences were young and old, tourists and regulars, people who had heard that something was happening in that room and wanted to see it for themselves. The stage was barely raised off the floor. The ceiling was low. Cigarette smoke hung in the light like fog. On any given night, a comedian could walk in, put his name on a list, and stand 10 feet from strangers with nothing but a microphone and whatever he was brave enough to say. For the men who worked that room, it was not about the money. There was almost none. It was about finding out what was real. The comedians who survived that room were the ones who learned to stop hiding. And two of the men who kept coming back, night after night, were George Carlin and Richard Pryor, both of them, in those years, quietly falling apart and putting themselves back together at the same time. The night had started like any other. Carlin had come in late, put his name down, and waited in the back with a cup of coffee while other comedians took their turns. Some killing, some dying, all of them measuring themselves against the two quiet men in the room who never seemed to be watching, but somehow saw everything. Pryor was there too, off to the side, half in conversation and half somewhere else, the way he often was. When Carlin's name was called, he walked up through the smoke and the low light and lifted the microphone off the stand. The crowd recognized him, and there was a warm ripple of applause. They knew this man. They had seen him on television for years. They had come expecting the sharp, funny observer, the one who could take an ordinary word and turn it inside out until you laughed at something you had said your whole life without ever really hearing it. And for the first stretch of the set, that is exactly what they got. The laughs came easy. The timing was perfect. Somewhere near the side of the stage, Richard Pryor drifted closer, drawn by something he could not yet name. Because underneath the easy laughter, Pryor could hear it, a change in Carlin's voice, a weight coming into the room. Carlin was moving toward something. The jokes were getting quieter. The pauses were getting longer. He was walking the crowd, laugh by laugh, toward a place where the laughter was going to stop. And he knew it. You could see, in the way he held that microphone, that he knew exactly where he was taking them. Richard Pryor understood that danger better than almost anyone alive. By the mid-1970s, Pryor was becoming something the country had never quite seen before. He did not tell jokes so much as open a door and walk the audience straight into his own life. He talked about his childhood, his fears, his mistakes, the people he had loved and the people he had hurt. He put pain and laughter in the same sentence and refused to separate them. Audiences would be roaring one moment and sitting in stunned quiet the next, unsure whether to laugh or look away. People walked out of his shows changed, carrying something they had not come in with, unable to fully explain what they had just seen. He had also walked away from a safer version of himself. Years before, he too had been a smoother, more polished performer, the kind who could have coasted on television for a decade, telling the comfortable jokes the rooms expected. And he too had burned that man down in front of a live crowd in one unrepeatable moment, and started over with nothing but the truth and the fear that came with it. He knew, better than anyone, what it cost a man to stop hiding on a stage. So when Richard Pryor watched another comedian work, he was not watching for the jokes. He was watching for the thing underneath the jokes. He could tell within seconds whether a man on a stage was performing or confessing. Most were performing. That was fine. That was the job. But every so often, standing in the dark at the edge of a room, Pryor would see someone stop performing entirely. And on this particular night, in this small club off the Strip, that is exactly what he saw George Carlin begin to do. From the wings, Richard Pryor watched the silence spread across the room like water. He had seen 1,000 comedians chase a laugh. He had almost never seen one walk straight past the laugh on purpose and reach for something harder. What Carlin was doing was the most dangerous thing a comedian could do. He was risking the one thing that kept a stand-up safe, the sound of an audience laughing, and he was trading it for a few seconds of naked truth. It could have died. The room could have turned cold, could have coughed and shifted and reached for the exits, Instead, it held. The silence was not rejection. It was recognition. Every person in that room understood that they were hearing something real, and the quiet was the sound of them knowing it. Then Carlin let the moment go. He found his way back, eased them into a laugh, released the tension, and finished his set to real applause, the kind that comes from people who feel like they have been let in on something. He walked off into the dark at the edge of the stage, and that was where Richard Pryor was standing, waiting for him. The two men stood close in the shadows for a moment, the noise of the club rushing back in around them. And Pryor looked at him and said the sentence Carlin would carry for the rest of his life. He said quietly, "That silence, that's the whole game. Anybody can make them laugh. You just made them listen." Then it happened. In the middle of a bit the crowd was still laughing at, George Carlin slowed down. He let a line hang in the air, and instead of reaching for the next joke, the safe joke, the one that would have kept the laughter rolling, he did something else. He stopped. He looked out at the room, past the front tables, past the smoke, into the back of the club, where the faces disappeared into the dark. And he said something true. Not a joke dressed up as truth. The truth itself, about the country, about the words people were allowed to say and the words they were not, about how much of ordinary life was a performance that everyone had quietly agreed to pretend was real. There was no punchline coming. He was not setting anyone up. He was simply standing in front of strangers and telling them something he believed, plainly, without the safety of a laugh, waiting at the end of it. For a comedian, it was like stepping off a ledge with no net below, giving away the one thing that told him the room was still with him. And the room felt the change instantly. The laughter did not fade. It stopped. All at once, a room full of people who had come to be entertained found themselves being told the truth, and they did not quite know what to do with their hands or their faces. Nobody moved. Nobody reached for a drink. For a few long seconds, the most crowded room on Sunset Boulevard was completely, perfectly silent. George Carlin never forgot it. In the years that followed, he would become one of the most fearless voices in the history of American comedy. He would fill concert halls. He would make specials that people argued about for decades. He would stand in front of enormous crowds and say the things other people were afraid even to think. And through all of it, he chased that silence. Not the laugh, the silence. The moment when a room stopped laughing because it was too busy listening. He had spent the early part of his career terrified of exactly that quiet, certain that silence meant failure. It took another man, standing in the dark of a small club off the Strip, to tell him that the silence was not the failure. It was the point. For the rest of his career, Carlin would build entire specials around that idea. Long stretches where the comedy fell away, and he simply looked out at thousands of people and told them the truth, waiting for that same hush he had first heard on Sunset Boulevard. He learned that a room could love you for the laughs, but it would remember you for the moments you were brave enough to stop. Richard Pryor would go on to his own kind of greatness, and the two of them would remain, in their separate ways, the men who showed a generation that you could be funny and honest in the same breath. They were not rivals that night. They were two men who had each walked away from a safer version of themselves, recognizing something in the other that almost no one else could see. Most of the people in that club never knew what they had witnessed. There is no recording of it, no photograph. Just a room that went quiet, a sentence spoken in the dark, and two men who understood each other for a moment on Sunset Boulevard. George Carlin spent the rest of his life trying to make audiences fall silent. And every time a room did, some part of him was still standing in that doorway, hearing Richard Pryor's voice. "You just made them listen."